This is it, the ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
We love you. We truly do. Before we begin tonight's story, take a deep breath. Let the world outside this moment fade for a little while. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee or maybe your blanket and let's begin. Because tonight's story drifts between worlds. The kind that hums softly beneath the noise. The kind that remember even when we try to forget. The night was dim in the Smith household. Not dark exactly, just soft enough that the hum of Rick's machines seemed louder than usual, steady like a mechanical heartbeat. The garage was lit by a single blue lamp. It flickered faintly, reflecting off tools and glass tubes, off stains and metal. It smelled of old electricity and quiet sorrow. Rick sat there hunched over the workbench, a silhouette against the light, staring into the kind of nothingness that only geniuses and insomniacs seem to notice. On the table lay an envelope, creased, faded and worn from too many hands. It was stamped with words almost too faint to read now. Unity's wedding. The paper trembled slightly under the garage fan, but Rick's fingers held it still. He took a long sip from the flask beside him. The liquid burned the way he liked, enough to silence thought, but not quite enough to erase it. Somewhere in the background, his machines hummed, buzzed, clicked. Then, from within the static of the interdimensional cable box, came something unusual. A faint melody, fragile and nearly lost between channels, threaded through the noise. It wasn't one of Rick's old shows or cosmic broadcasts. It sounded human. It sounded tender. Rick's eyes narrowed, not out of anger, but memory. He didn't turn the dial. He didn't stop it either. The sound carried through the air like a half-remembered song you can't name, but somehow know by heart. For a moment, even the clutter in the garage seemed to listen. The melody wasn't perfect. It wavered, as though recorded long ago by hands that trembled, soft, uncertain, yet full of meaning. It was a lullaby, maybe, or a promise, something old enough that it should have been forgotten. But memory has strange ways of surviving, even inside machines. Rick placed the invitation down beside a pile of tools, staring at the name Unity until it blurred into watercolor shapes. The past has a cruel way of echoing, especially for people who never let go. He rubbed his forehead, sighed, and muttered something low, almost to himself. Not tonight, brain. Not tonight. But the melody refused to stop. It threaded through the static, slipping into the air vents, weaving through dust and silence until it reached the faint cracks under the door, escaping into the house beyond. It traveled like a ghost through walls and ceilings, curling into corners where memories sleep. Inside the living room, the TV was off. The only light came from the faint glow of the stars outside, filtered through the blinds. The hum carried softly into that space too, unnoticed like the whisper of the universe breathing. Rick sat back, exhaling smoke and thought. He remembered the first time he'd heard that tune, or something like it. It wasn't from a machine then. It was from her Unity. Not just a name, a voice, a collection of countless minds that somehow made him feel singular. They had shared a strange harmony, like two chaotic symphonies overlapping into brief order. For a moment in his long, broken life he had found rhythm. But rhythm always fades when the music ends. He had gone to that wedding. Or at least he'd tried. The memory came in fragments. White light, laughter, 1,000 faces merging, separating, merging again. He remembered her smile, or at least one version of it, across a sea of everything she was. And he remembered leaving before the vows. Now, years later, all that was left of it was statics, and this song that shouldn't exist. The garage lights flickered again. Somewhere in the corner, a portal gun hummed faintly, picking up the melody like an echo chamber. The sound grew softer, more distant, until it was barely there at all, like breath on glass. Rick leaned forward. "Where the hell did that come from?" he whispered, but his voice lacked the bite it used to have. It wasn't curiosity that moved him. It was something quieter. Regret, maybe. The kind that doesn't ache anymore but lingers like an old bruise. He opened the invitation again. The paper's texture was strange, part biological, part synthetic, just like Unity herself. On the back, faint ink had bled through over time. He could still read the first few words, "To the one who made me feel whole." He stopped there. Rick closed the envelope and stared at the floor, his mind wandering somewhere between timelines, memories, and the quiet hum of the present. There was no portal big enough to escape what he carried inside his chest. The melody faded completely now, replaced once more by static, white noise washing through the speakers like the sound of rain. Rick let it play. He didn't reach for the remote. Didn't move. Outside, the stars blinked like small, patient eyes. Inside, a man who had seen infinite universes sat in a small garage, lost in one of the few things he couldn't quantify, the sound of something fragile and kind that refused to disappear. He took another sip. The taste was sharp. The moment was quiet, and as the static continued, the faintest shape of a smile ghosted across his face. Not joy, not sorrow, just acknowledgement. The sort of expression you give to a memory when you know it's too late to change, but still worth remembering. Somewhere in the distance, the house creaked softly. As if exhaling, Rick leaned back in his chair, his eyelids heavy. The machines pulsed like a slow heartbeat around him. The faint scent of oil and ozone filled the air. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to listen. The melody returned once, faint as a dream slipping back before dawn. It whispered through the static like a voice saying something only he could hear. Then silence. For a moment, time seemed to pause, and in that silence the story began. Not with explosions or portals or experiments, but with a scientist sitting alone, listening to the quiet sound of what love leaves behind. And that, the narrator breathed softly, was how the song beneath the static first began. There are days the universe doesn't explode, doesn't twist, doesn't burn. Some days it just breathes. That's how it was on that day. The day the universe wore white. It wasn't the chaos that stayed with Rick. Chaos was normal. It was the silence before it. The quiet beauty that hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. He remembered that morning, or what passed for morning on that planet, with a clarity that unsettled him. The light had a golden tint, shimmering across an ocean of synchronized motion. Every living being on that world, all the minds connected through unity, moved like dancers following an unseen rhythm. Rick stood there in a white suit. It wasn't clean anymore, a little wrinkled, a little too formal for him. The tie hung crooked, as if rebelling against his attempt at respectability. Around him the guests were countless, all extensions of her. Every face was unity, every smile hers, and yet somehow in that impossible crowd she managed to feel singular. Unique. "Do you like it?" one of her voices had asked, stepping toward him. The tone was soft, amused, a question wrapped in knowing. Rick had taken a long drag from his flask, exhaled slowly, and muttered, "Yeah, it's too much, which, kinda suits you." They both laughed then, a sound that came from 1,000 throats at once but felt like one. The world shimmered around them, alive and breathing. Music began to play, not quite from instruments but from the hum of the collective itself. It was harmonic and disorienting, like listening to love translated into frequency. For a moment Rick felt small, not in a bad way, just humbled. The kind of smallness you feel when you realize you're standing in something bigger than comprehension. And for once, it isn't trying to kill you. He looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of being present. For someone who had seen infinite versions of himself die, cry and rebuild the world, this and standing still, feeling something real, was the strangest experience of all. Unity stepped closer, her form stabilizing into one face, one body, her way of meeting him halfway. She was radiant, wearing white not as purity but as unity itself, thousands of lives woven into one shining form. "You look uncomfortable," she said gently. Rick smirked. "That's how you know it's real." They stood in silence for a moment. The crowd around them and her, all her, moved in patterns of joy. Laughter echoed, champagne sparkled, and the sky itself seemed painted in pastel light, and yet beneath it all, Rick felt something fragile, a tremor in the perfection. A note out of tune in the song of connection. "Why invite me?" he asked finally. "You know I'm just going to ruin the mood." Unity smiled, not all at once this time, but through one expression, one real face. Because even chaos deserves a seat at peace. It was the kind of answer that hit harder than intended. Rick stared at her for a long time, his eyes reflecting light and distance. He wanted to say something clever, maybe cruel, to break the softness in the air. But for once words failed him. The ceremony began. The guests, all her, took their places in synchronized stillness. The officiant, also her, spoke with a voice that vibrated through the ground. The vows weren't just words. They were frequencies, emotions translated into waves that rippled across the world's atmosphere. Every syllable shimmered in the air, luminous and living. Rick stood at the edge, holding a glass of something blue and buzzing. He didn't understand why his chest felt tight. Maybe it was the drink. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was the realization that even the universe's most connected being could still be alone. He looked at her. Unity, as she stood before her mirror selves, ready to bind herself in perfect synchronization. There was no groom, no partner. It wasn't that kind of wedding. It was a ritual of completion, of self-embrace. The kind of ceremony Rick could never have, and yet she had invited him. The one person who lived on disconnection. As vows echoed through the air, the light changed. The sky deepened into a warm rose hue. Every living thing on that planet stopped moving for a moment, all breath, all thought, all song, to witness the union. Rick felt something shift in him then. He didn't belong there, but he didn't want to leave either. He could almost imagine staying, building something, feeling something, living something. Almost. When the music swelled again, Unity turned to him, her expression unreadable, but full of quiet gratitude. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Rick raised his glass. "Wouldn't miss it. I mean, who doesn't love a wedding with 8 billion brides?" She smiled, a sad knowing smile. The kind that sees through every joke. "You never let yourself believe you could be happy, do you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next part was a blur, laughter, color, motion. But something happened, something small, something human. He remembered stepping forward, reaching for her hand, and for just 1 second feeling warmth. Then the stillness. No explosion, no chaos. Just silence. The sound of the universe holding its breath. The vows ended, and Unity, all of her, shimmered like glass catching sunlight. Rick blinked. The wine glass in his hand reflected the color of the sky, deep red against white fabric. It looked almost like blood, though none had been spilled. It was symbolic, maybe, or maybe just another thing his brain refused to process. The universe had worn white that day, but he had left with red in his memory, the color of what he couldn't say, what he couldn't stay for. Later, when the guests began to fade, Unity found him again. Her voice was softer now, less collective, more human. "You'll keep running," she said. "But maybe one day you'll stop." Rick adjusted his collar, turned away. "Yeah, maybe, but don't wait up." He opened a portal, a tear of blue light against a white world, and stepped through. The last thing he heard before it closed was her voice, fading into harmony with the crowd. "Goodbye." Rick, now years later, sitting in his dim garage. That memory still haunted him. Not the chaos, not the leaving, but the beauty of a day when even the universe seemed to wear white just for him. And in the quiet hum of his machines, the faintest echo of that vow still lingered, not as sound, but as static. That night, the sky above the Smith house looked unusually alive. Morty sat by his bedroom window, knees tucked under his blanket, chin resting on the cold glass. The world outside shimmered faintly with falling stars, thousands of them, slipping silently through the dark like whispers of forgotten dreams. He'd seen shooting stars before. Rick had once explained them as burning junk, pieces of space debris caught in atmospheric friction. "Nothing magical about it," Rick had said, waving his hand dismissively, a wrench in the other. But tonight felt different. Tonight each falling light felt personal, like the universe was quietly crying. Morty didn't know why Rick had been so quiet lately. The garage lights were still on most nights, humming their metallic lullaby, but the sound was gentler now, slower. Rick didn't yell as much, didn't slam things, didn't invite him on adventures anymore, just silence, and that faint humming that seemed to vibrate through the house's foundation. Sometimes Morty would peek into the garage door crack and see him sitting there, not tinkering, not drinking, just staring. Once Morty thought he heard music. Not the loud, chaotic kind Rick sometimes played when he was inventing, but something soft, melodic, almost sad. It was faint, like someone remembering a song they used to love but couldn't quite finish. Tonight, Morty wondered what kind of memory made Rick so still. He leaned closer to the window and whispered, "Make a wish." It was silly, he knew that. But still, as another star fell trailing light across the endless black, Morty closed his eyes and wished anyway. He wished Rick would smile again, the real kind, the one that happened before he remembered to hide it. He didn't tell anyone about these nights. Not Beth, who worried in her own quiet way, or Summer, who covered sadness with sarcasm. It wasn't that Morty wanted to keep secrets. It was just that the sadness in Rick didn't feel like something to fix. It felt like weather, something that moved through all of them, shaping their days in invisible ways. Down the hall, the house was asleep. Only the faint hum of the fridge, the ticking of a wall clock, and the soft mechanical murmur from the garage kept the silence from swallowing everything. Morty liked that sound. It made him feel like Rick was still there, still thinking, still something. He picked up one of Rick's old gadgets from his desk, a strange, cracked device that used to be part of a portal gun. It didn't work anymore, but Morty kept it near his window. It glowed faintly when the stars passed by, pulsing like a heartbeat. Sometimes he'd imagine it was connected to wherever Rick went, when he didn't come home until dawn. Tonight, the glow was steady, warm. He thought of all the places they'd been, oceans made of sound, planets that laughed, timelines that folded like paper, but none of that felt as big as this silence. The space between them had become its own kind of universe, vast, quiet, filled with stars that never stopped falling. Morty sighed softly. "You okay, Rick?" he whispered, as if the night could carry his words through walls. The garage light flickered in response, a faint pulse behind the curtain of darkness. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. He smiled a little, that small, unsure kind of smile that happens when you want to believe in something, even if logic says not to. Outside, the stars kept falling. Each one disappeared before it could touch the ground, leaving nothing behind but a soft echo of light. Morty thought about how everything Rick built eventually vanished too. Universes, inventions, relationships. Maybe falling stars were just the universe's way of reminding them that beauty didn't have to last to matter. He remembered something Rick had said once, on a night when they'd nearly died again. "Don't get too sentimental. Morty, the universe doesn't care." But what Rick didn't realize was that Morty did. He cared so much it hurt sometimes. He glanced toward the hallway, quiet, then toward the garage, still humming. And then, softly, he whispered to no one in particular, "It's okay to miss people, you know." He imagined saying it to Rick, but also to himself. Maybe they both needed to hear it. A breeze slipped through the half-open window, brushing his face with the faint scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled like a tired old god turning in his sleep. The world felt heavy but calm, like the pause between heartbeats. Morty thought about his grandpa, the wild genius who had seen everything, and yet seemed haunted by a single thing he couldn't fix. Maybe that's what love was for Rick. Something that didn't fit into equations or bottles. Something that refused to obey. He closed his eyes again, listening. The hum from the garage changed slightly, softer, slower, like breathing. It almost sounded like a melody. Not clear, not perfect, but real. The same tune he thought he'd heard before, buried in the static. He didn't move. Didn't want to scare it away. The sound wove through the quiet, mechanical, fragile, beautiful. Morty's heartbeat synced to it, his breathing falling into rhythm with the strange lullaby coming from below. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid of the dark. He felt connected, like the stars outside. The hum in the garage and the small ache in his chest were all part of the same story. He opened his eyes just in time to see one last star fall, the brightest, one of all, streaking across the sky before fading into nothing. Morty didn't make another wish. He didn't need to, because in that quiet moment he realized something. Maybe not every light was meant to stay. Maybe some just passed by to remind you that the sky was watching. "Two," he whispered softly, almost smiling. "Good night, Rick." Down below in the garage, the hum stopped for a heartbeat, just one, and then resumed. Quieter than before. Maybe Rick heard him. Maybe not. But somewhere between the stars and the machines, between the boy by the window and the man lost in his memories, something unspoken reached across the silence. A thread, thin as light, strong as love. And that night, long after the last star faded, Morty finally fell asleep with the faintest trace of a smile on his face, the melody still echoing somewhere deep in his dreams. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, soft and forgiving. The house smelled faintly of dust and cold coffee, the usual perfume of Rick's quiet moods. Beth stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring her drink, even though the spoon had long since stopped moving. The clinking sound filled the silence like a heartbeat. She'd found it that morning, a small piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, curled slightly as though it had been hidden in heat for too long. It was lying under a pile of old blueprints in Rick's garage, not tucked away, just forgotten. The paper had once been an invitation. The words were faint now, smudged by age and perhaps a few drops of something that might have been whiskey, or maybe tears. Unity's wedding, it read in Rick's unmistakable handwriting, angular, impatient, brilliant. Beth had never met Unity, but she'd heard of her, not from Rick, of course, but from whispers. A strange story, passed down through fragments of conversations where love and chaos blurred together. Some said Unity was a hive mind, others said she was an idea that fell in love with a man too fractured to stay. Beth turned the invitation over in her hands. On the back, written in a softer hand, one that didn't seem like Rick's usual mechanical scrawl, were 3 words. Don't be late. She didn't know who wrote them, but somehow they hurt more than the rest. The morning felt heavier now. She leaned against the counter, the cup warm in her hand, and stared at the garage door. She could hear the faint hum of Rick's machines, the familiar rhythm that had been her lullaby as a child. Back then she used to fall asleep to that sound, the soft, consistent buzz of science and sadness leaking through the walls. She never told anyone that she used to sneak into the lab just to listen. There was a time when Rick would hum along to his gadgets, tuneless, distracted, yet comforting. It was the only music in her childhood. Sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night and tiptoe down the hallway just to make sure that hum was still there. Because if it was, it meant Rick hadn't left again. Now as she listened, she realized something was different. The hum wasn't steady anymore. It stuttered, like breathing between sobs. Beth set her cup down and quietly made her way to the garage. The air inside was cold metallic. Tools scattered across the desk. Blueprints pinned to the wall like ghosts of unfinished dreams. The portal gun sat in pieces, disassembled as if even it had lost its purpose. And there on the far side sat Rick. He wasn't asleep, though his eyes looked tired enough to be. He was staring at something flickering on the screen, a still image frozen mid-frame. 2 figures blurred, surrounded by light. A wedding scene. Beth didn't speak. She didn't want to. There was something about the moment and about Rick's stillness that felt sacred, fragile. Like the quiet before a confession no one was ready to make. She took one small step closer, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. Rick's shoulders twitched slightly as if he heard her, but he didn't turn. You ever keep something? Beth started quietly. Not because it's useful, but because you don't know how to let it go. Rick gave a small exhale. Not a sigh, not a laugh, something in between. Beth smiled faintly, more to herself than him. Yeah, I figured. She looked around the room. Every shelf was lined with half-built things, broken gadgets, failed ideas. But she saw them differently now. They weren't just tools. They were fragments, little pieces of Rick's heart disguised as machinery. She wanted to ask him about Unity, about the wedding, about why he'd kept the invitation. But she didn't, because she already knew the answers didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, the silence, the soft hum, and the faint reflection of 2 people who didn't know how to talk about love, but felt it anyway. Rick finally spoke, his voice dry, distant. You shouldn't go through my stuff, Beth, she smiled gently. You shouldn't leave your memories lying around then. That got the smallest flicker of something from him, not quite a smirk, but close. For a moment, neither of them moved. The screen flickered again, showing the same 2 figures, dancing or maybe just swaying in a slow rhythm under alien stars. Beth wondered if Rick was one of them. Is that her? She asked softly. Rick didn't answer. The silence stretched, fragile and long. Beth didn't fill it. Instead, she took a slow breath and whispered, You know, when I was a kid, you used to hum in here. I thought it was the machines at first, but then I realized it was you. You'd hum when you were building something or thinking. Sometimes I'd fall asleep to it. Rick's eyes flicked toward her for the first time. There was something in them. Recognition, maybe. Or guilt, or both, did I? He muttered, as if testing the memory for truth. Yeah, Beth said softly. You did. He looked away, reaching for a tool that didn't need to be used. Guess that was before I learned silence is easier, he said under his breath. Beth's heart clenched. Maybe, she said quietly. But silence doesn't fix anything. It just makes the hurt quieter. Rick didn't respond, but his hand stopped moving. She took that as enough. The invitation was still in her hand. She folded it carefully and placed it on the workbench next to him. You should keep it somewhere safe, she whispered. Memories don't have to make sense to matter. Then she turned and walked out, the door creaking softly behind her. Back in the kitchen. The light had changed, warmer now, spilling across the table in gold patterns. She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cooling mug, and stared at the garage door once more. Somewhere beyond it, she heard Rick's machine start up again. Not the harsh mechanical grind she was used to, but a softer hum, steady and slow. It almost sounded like a song. Beth closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt something she didn't have a word for. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just the quiet comfort of knowing that maybe, in some strange way, her father was still trying. And in that small, trembling space between memory and noise, between silence and song, Beth whispered to the morning air, "It's okay. Dad, you can remember." The machines hummed on, steady now, like an old lullaby finally finding its rhythm again. There are some memories that live between the seconds, too soft to measure, too fragile to touch. Rick had one of those, buried in a part of his mind even the alcohol couldn't dissolve. It began not with a word or a face, but with a rhythm, the faint hum of life that once beat in harmony with his own. Tonight, in the quiet solitude of his garage, that rhythm returned. It started as a flicker across the broken screen. A glitch, maybe, or a ghost. Then through the static came a sound, laughter, hers. Unity's. That same laughter that had filled entire planets, echoing through 1,000 voices speaking as one. Rick froze. His hand, holding the half-empty flask, trembled just enough to make the liquid ripple like a reflection of something he couldn't look at directly. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing at the glow. Guess the universe can't take a hint, he muttered. The image grew clearer. It wasn't just unity. It was them. Together. A ballroom suspended in air, illuminated by constellations that pulsed with synchronized breath. Every living thing on that planet, every plant, every being moved in rhythm, not by command but by connection. And in the center of it all stood unity, radiant and infinite, dressed in a hue Rick could never quite name. Not red, not violet, something that felt like the color of understanding. Rick watched as the version of himself on screen stepped closer to her. His younger self, cleaner shaven, eyes brighter. There was a spark there that the present version had long since learned to extinguish. You looked happy, murmured a voice behind him. Rick didn't turn. Morty stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, half asleep. The kid must have come in looking for a snack or some reassurance that the world wasn't ending. Again. Rick grunted softly. You shouldn't be up, Morty. Morty shrugged. Couldn't sleep. TV's all static, Rick almost smiled. Yeah, it tends to do that. On screen, Unity and Rick began to move, not dancing in the human sense, but orbiting each other in slow, deliberate arcs, like celestial bodies pulled by invisible gravity. The hum of the planet grew into a song. Every molecule seemed to sway with it. Is that her? Morty asked, his voice softer now, as though he sensed something sacred in the air. Rick nodded, eyes never leaving the image. Yeah, that's Unity. Morty hesitated, then said, She looks happy. Rick let out a quiet laugh, one without humor, just breath and memory. She always was. That was the problem. They watched in silence. The music in the recording swelled, slow and hypnotic. It wasn't really music, more like a feeling given sound. Morty's eyelids fluttered as he listened. It was that kind of melody, the kind that made your thoughts slow down until even sadness began to soften. Rick remembered that night clearly now. The dance had gone on for hours. Not a word spoken, just Unity's presence flowing through everything, through him. For once his mind had been quiet. No equations, no screams, no regrets clawing at the edges of consciousness. Just connection, and then in a single, almost imperceptible shift it all fell apart. Unity had looked at him, really looked, and for the first time Rick saw pity in her eyes. He remembered that look like a brand. She had smiled, but it wasn't the kind that promised more tomorrows. It was the kind people give when they've already decided to leave. Rick blinked. The image on the screen had frozen again. Unity's hand extended toward him, the other holding a glass filled with red liquid that shimmered like spilled wine. Morty whispered, "What happened?" Rick's throat tightened, words catching somewhere between truth and defense. "She realized," he said finally, "that I don't know how to stay." Morty frowned, unsure if that was supposed to be an excuse or a confession. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Did you love her?" Rick turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed on the ghost on the screen. "I loved the idea of her," he said, "a mind that could hold mine without breaking." He paused, fingers drumming lightly on the workbench. "But love's not about being understood. It's about not running when you don't." Morty didn't say anything. He just nodded, and for a moment that was enough. Rick reached out and pressed a few keys. The image began to move again, but slower this time. Not quite real-time. More like a dream replaying itself underwater. He could see the exact moment Unity let go. She stepped back, her form dissolving into light. Her voice echoing through the shared consciousness that had once wrapped around him like a blanket. The room dimmed as the screen faded to black. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the garage filled the silence, that same lullaby rhythm that seemed to follow Rick everywhere. Finally, Morty said quietly, "It's kinda sad, but also kinda beautiful, you know." Rick's eyes softened, the corners tired but not cold. "That's how the universe works, Morty. Every beautiful thing ends before you can figure out why it started." Morty nodded again, slower this time. "But it still matters, right?" Rick didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and clicked the monitor off. The sudden darkness felt like an exhale. Morty yawned, leaning against the doorframe. "Guess I'll go back to bed." "Yeah," Rick murmured. "Good idea." As Morty shuffled away, Rick poured himself another drink, not much, just enough to taste memory. He looked once more at the dark screen, seeing not the image but the feeling it left behind. That night he didn't work. He didn't build, he just sat there, letting the hum of the garage wash over him like a tide he no longer fought. In the dim reflection of the metal wall, he thought he saw movement. A flicker, maybe a shimmer of Unity's form. She wasn't there, of course. But the rhythm remained. Slow, steady, alive. Rick closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like escaping. He just listened. The machines hummed softly. Somewhere beyond the walls, a star exploded. Silent, beautiful, necessary, and in that silence, in that fading afterglow of memory, Rick let himself imagine a world where he'd learned to keep dancing. The last dance of Unity played on, not in sound, not in sight, but in the quiet pulse of a man remembering what it meant to be known. If only for a moment, the days that followed were quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, not the sort that wraps around a home like a blanket, but the sort that lingers in corners and under floorboards, where words used to live. In the Smith household, time seemed to pause after the laughter faded. The garage door stayed shut more often than open. The usual crashes, the sparks, the muttered curses, gone. The portal gun sat disassembled on the table, pieces scattered like bones of something that had lived once, but didn't anymore. Rick wasn't gone. He was there, always there, moving through the house like a shadow pretending to be a man. He still woke early, still poured coffee he didn't drink, still fiddled with parts that didn't need fixing. But everything he touched seemed already repaired. Or maybe it was that nothing was broken enough to matter. The hum of the machines filled the garage like a heartbeat, constant, familiar, but something in it had changed. It wasn't angry anymore. It was almost tender, like the machines themselves had grown tired of shouting for attention. Beth noticed first. Every morning, when she came down to get ready for work, she'd see the same mug sitting on the counter, still warm, barely touched. Sometimes she'd pick it up and take a sip herself, half expecting to find a clue in the taste. It was bitter, metallic, a little like regret. She'd glance toward the garage door, hear the faint sound of tools clinking, and sigh. When she was a kid, the sound of that garage had comforted her. It meant her father was close, not present, but close enough to feel like the world still made sense. Now it just sounded lonely. One afternoon, she gathered the courage to walk in. Rick was hunched over a circuit board, soldering without focus. His eyes were half-lidded, lost somewhere far away. "Hey," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Hey, yourself." She crossed her arms, glancing around. "You've been out here all week. You building something?" Rick gave a small shrug. "Nah, just fixing things that don't need fixing." Beth stepped closer. "Like what?" Rick smirked faintly. "Me, maybe." The words hung there, too honest to laugh at, too painful to address. Beth looked down at the workbench. Among the tools and wires was a small speaker, still faintly glowing. It was playing something. Not music exactly, but a low droning hum that pulsed like static between heartbeats. "Is that supposed to make noise?" she asked. Rick finally looked up, meeting her eyes for a brief second. "It's supposed to remember," Beth frowned. "Remember what?" He leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking. "Everything." She didn't press further. She didn't have to. The tone in his voice told her enough. That night the house grew quieter still. Summer fell asleep with headphones in, watching some mindless video. Morty stared at the TV, flipping channels even though he wasn't really watching anything. Every station sounded like the same thing, soft static, the kind that creeps under your skin when silence feels too heavy. Even Jerry, in his own way, felt the stillness. He tried making jokes at dinner, tried getting everyone to laugh, but each attempt floated up hollow and died before reaching the ceiling. "Man," he said with a forced chuckle, "we used to be funny, right?" No one answered. Beth gave a half-smile, the polite kind you give someone trying too hard. "We still are," she said, but the words didn't stick. Later that night, Morty wandered into the garage again. The hum was softer now, steady, almost musical. Rick was still at his desk, a half-empty flask beside him. His gaze fixed on nothing. Morty hesitated. "Hey, Rick?" Rick didn't move. "Yeah? You okay?" Rick snorted. "Define okay." Morty kicked at the floor, awkward. "I don't know, you just seem different. Not like bad different, just quiet." Rick exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "Kid, you ever realize how loud everything is when people are trying not to feel something?" Morty blinked. I guess?" Rick pointed at the ceiling. "TV, arguments, portal blasts, and all noise. All ways to drown out the stuff that hurts. You stop making noise and suddenly it all comes crawling back." Morty didn't really understand, but he nodded anyway. Rick reached over and twisted a dial on the desk. The hum shifted, becoming warmer, almost comforting. "You hear that?" Morty nodded again. "Yeah, it's kinda nice." "Yeah," Rick said softly. "That's what peace sounds like before it hurts again." Morty frowned. "That's depressing." Rick chuckled, a real one this time, rough but genuine. "Welcome to adulthood, Morty." They stayed there for a while. No inventions, no adventures, just two people sitting in the dim light of a lab that suddenly felt more like a memory than a place. Outside, rain began to fall, faint at first, then steady. The sound merged with the hum of the machines until it all became one gentle rhythm. Beth peeked through the window from the kitchen, seeing the faint glow of the garage lights. She didn't go out there. She just watched for a moment, smiling faintly. There was something sacred in that silence, a kind of healing too fragile to disturb. In the morning, she left a mug of coffee by Rick's desk. She didn't say anything, didn't write a note. Just placed it there, steam rising, the smell mixing with metal and oil. Rick found it hours later. He stared at it, unreadable, then smiled. Barely, but enough. He didn't drink it. He didn't pour it out either. He just left it there, letting it cool beside him as the machines hummed. By evening, the static from the garage had softened into something almost melodic. Morty caught himself humming along without realizing it. Summer upstairs paused her music when she noticed the faint rhythm bleeding through the walls. It was strange. It didn't sound sad anymore. It sounded alive. The laughter hadn't returned. The chaos hadn't come back. But something else had, something gentler. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was the first breath after grief, that quiet, trembling sound the world makes when it's deciding to keep going. The Smith house slept a little easier that night, and in the garage, Rick sat alone listening to the hum of his machines, the rain tapping on the roof, and the silence after laughter, a silence that, for once, didn't feel empty. Morning light stumbled lazily through the blinds, splashing soft gold across the kitchen floor. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt polite, like it was trying not to wake anyone's ghosts. Jerry Smith sat at the table, staring into a half-empty bowl of cereal. The milk had gone warm, the flakes soggy and grey. He was used to eating alone, though sometimes he still pretended someone might join him, that Beth might wander in with her work tablet or that Rick would grumble something. Cynical about nutritionally useless domestic rituals, but today, even his imagination stayed in bed. The hum from Rick's garage drifted faintly through the floorboards, a constant reminder that somewhere below genius was mourning in its own mechanical way. Jerry didn't understand what exactly had happened, something about a wedding, something about love and loss, but even he could feel it. The air in the house had grown heavier, like the weight of one man's silence was enough to tilt the whole world. He sighed, pushing the cereal away. He wasn't sure what to do with himself anymore. Everyone else seemed to have a role in the quiet. Beth watched from a distance. Morty hovered near Rick. Summer filled her silence with songs. But Jerry? He was just extra noise. He wandered to the cabinet where the dusty bottles lived, relics of optimism and bad ideas. He wasn't much of a drinker, not since that one night he'd tried to bond with Rick and ended up crying about tax deductions. Still, he opened the cabinet door, scanning the bottles until one caught his eye. It was old amber glass sealed with a crooked cork. A label handwritten in Rick's scrawl read, "To better choices." Jerry chuckled softly. Yeah, right. He turned it in his hand, the liquid inside catching the morning light like trapped fire. Maybe it was just another one of Rick's weird science drinks. Alien gin, quantum whiskey, or some other cosmic hangover waiting to happen. Or maybe it was just a drink. Either way, it looked like it had been waiting for someone to open it. He reached for a glass but stopped halfway. No, he thought. This needs a moment. So he carried the bottle to the living room, brushed the dust off an old coffee table and sat down. The couch springs sighed beneath him. He thought about making a toast. To what, he wasn't sure. Maybe to being ignored less. Maybe to surviving another quiet day in a house that didn't really need him. He pulled the cork out. It made a soft pop, like the start of something important. The smell was strange. Part alcohol, part metal, part memory. He poured a little into the glass. All right, he said aloud, raising it toward no one in particular. To better choices. He took a sip. The taste was unlike anything he'd ever had. Sweet at first, then bitter. Then something else entirely. A flicker of warmth that wasn't physical. For a second, the room seemed to shimmer. The air rippled like heat on desert sand, and suddenly Jerry wasn't in the living room anymore. He was standing somewhere bright, impossibly bright, with colors that didn't exist in normal air. The hum of voices surrounded him, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, and there in the center of it all was Rick Sanchez, wearing something that almost looked like a suit. His hair was neater, his eyes clearer. People, or not people maybe, danced around him. The walls pulsed like living fabric, threads of light weaving in rhythm to the music. Jerry blinked, looking down at himself. He was holding the same drink, though now it glowed faintly, like it remembered where it came from. He turned, and there she was, Unity. He'd seen her before once or twice, though never like this. Not as a concept or a story, but as a presence. She smiled, and in that smile Jerry felt the ache of 1,000 shared memories. "Who are you?" she asked gently. "I'm, Jerry," he said awkwardly. "Rick's son-in-law?" "Ah," she said, tilting her head, the light in her eyes dimming softly. "Then you knew him." "After? After what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked past him where Rick stood laughing, real laughter, unguarded and wild. It was the kind of laughter that made people want to believe in second chances. Jerry followed her gaze. Rick was holding a glass too, his eyes reflecting the stars above. For the first time, Jerry saw something human in him, not the cynical scientist or the broken man, but someone alive. He felt a pang of guilt, watching. Maybe Rick wasn't cruel because he wanted to be. Maybe he was just scared of losing the version of himself that once knew how to love. The thought hit Jerry like a wave. He raised his glass again, almost instinctively. "To love, I guess," he whispered. Unity looked at him and smiled. That small, knowing kind of smile that doesn't need words. And just like that, the vision faded. The music, the lights, the laughter, gone. Jerry was back in the living room, sitting alone with the half-empty glass. The bottle shimmered faintly on the table. For a moment he thought he heard faint echoes, distant laughter carried through static. Then silence again. He exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that was something. He didn't tell anyone about what he'd seen. Not Beth, not Rick, especially not Rick. It felt too personal, like he'd accidentally stepped into someone else's dream. Later that evening, he found himself in the kitchen again, staring at the empty space beside him. He poured a tiny bit more into the glass and raised it one last time. "To people who try," he murmured. "Even when it doesn't work out." He took the sip, softer this time. The warmth didn't bring visions now, just calm. Upstairs, Beth was reading quietly. Morty's laughter drifted faintly from his room. Rick was still in the garage, the machines humming their eternal song. The bottle on the table caught the light, glowing softly, like a quiet toast passed between worlds. Jerry leaned back, eyes half closed, and smiled. For once, he didn't feel left out. He didn't feel invisible. He just felt part of something, however small. A shared ache, a shared memory, a shared hope. In that stillness, he understood something Rick might never say out loud. Love doesn't die. It just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes music, sometimes static, sometimes a bottle labeled to better choices, and Jerry, of all people, had been the one to remember it. The next morning, Beth found the glass still on the table. She noticed the bottle's label and smiled faintly. She didn't know what it was, or why it was open, but she didn't move it. She just whispered, almost to herself, "To better choices," and went on with her day. Down in the garage, Rick paused mid-solder. For reasons he couldn't explain, he smiled too, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of his mouth. The machines hummed softly, matching the rhythm of his breath. Somewhere a memory flickered. A toast, a laugh, a promise that once felt real. The silence after laughter was still there, but this time it didn't hurt. It just hummed. The garage was quieter now, softer somehow, not in sound but in feeling. Machines that once buzzed with manic purpose now exhaled a steady hum like sighs from tired lungs. The light from the ceiling flickered gently, painting shifting halos across Rick's face as he sat hunched over a console cluttered with tools, wires and empty flasks. For 3 nights, he hadn't really slept, not the kind of sleep that forgets. His mind had become a tangle of noise, laughter, echoes, words he wished he hadn't said. Every so often, a flicker from the console caught his attention. The old AI system he'd built years ago was booting itself up again. He didn't remember turning it on. The screen pulsed, green text stuttering across its face. "Memory replay sequence found." Rick frowned, muttering, "What the hell?" He tapped a few keys, expecting gibberish data or an error code. Instead, the garage filled with sound, faint, broken, but unmistakably human. A laugh. Then another, a woman's voice, soft and fluid, like water rippling over glass. He froze. He knew that laugh. He'd forgotten its tone, its color, the way it wrapped around his name like a melody. But here it was again, haunting him with unbearable tenderness. "Unity," he whispered. The AI responded automatically. In its monotone voice, playback continues. "Would you like to delete this file?" Rick didn't answer. The clip continued, and with snippets of sound fragmented like dreams. Her voice blending with his, then laughter again. At one point, you could hear the sound of glasses clinking, the shimmer of music from some alien celebration. And somewhere in that chaos, the faint hum of the same melody that had lingered in the static since the beginning of all this. Rick sank into his chair. The metal creaked beneath him. He looked smaller suddenly, like the weight of remembering had stolen something from his posture. He could see it all. The day of the wedding. The white skies. The synchronization of billions of minds moving as one. He remembered her face, or at least the feeling of it. The way she looked at him, not with admiration or awe, but understanding. That rare look people give when they've seen every flaw and stayed anyway. He remembered dancing, Clumsy, awkward, but real. Her voice in his ear. "You're terrible at this, you know." And his reply, "Yeah, but you like me anyway." A chuckle escaped him now. Quiet, dry, but real. The AI flickered again. Another file began to play. This time no words, just humming. Her humming. The same melody. It wasn't perfect. She'd missed notes. But it had rhythm, life, memory. Rick felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't grief exactly. It was softer, more complicated, nostalgia with edges. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes reflecting the flicker of the screen. "You just had to leave a trace, huh?" he murmured. "Couldn't let me forget." The AI, ever obedient, replied, "Would you like me to delete her?" Rick hesitated. His finger hovered over the keyboard. He should delete it. He deleted everything eventually. Feelings, attachments, memories, all got dismantled, catalogued, burned. That was how he stayed functional. But tonight, the hum of the garage felt different. Less like a laboratory, more like a confessional. So he pressed Enter. Not delete. Play. The melody grew louder. The AI replayed old snippets. Laughter, phrases, fragmented conversations. It even began stitching them together, as if it wanted to rebuild the moment itself. Somewhere deep in the processor, lines of forgotten code responded, creating a simulation of her voice that began to sound almost alive. "Rick," the voice said softly, "you don't have to fix everything." He froze. That line hadn't been in the recordings. He'd never coded it. "Rick," she repeated, the voice trembling faintly with distortion. "You don't have to fix this. Just listen." For a moment he wanted to tear it apart, the wires, the circuits, the illusion of comfort. But he couldn't, because the garage, the machines, even the static, everything around him seemed to lean toward that voice, as if the universe itself wanted him to listen too. So he did. He leaned back, closed his eyes and let the sound fill the room. The melody swelled and softened, wrapping itself around the hum of the portal gun, the beeping of the consoles, the pulse of the lights. Everything synced together. The machines, the air, his heartbeat. It felt peaceful. When the playback ended, the garage went quiet again. The only light came from the faint green glow of the console, waiting patiently for instruction. Rick reached for his flask, but didn't drink. Instead, he looked at the machine and whispered, "Keep it." The AI blinked once, acknowledging the command. File preserved. He stared at the screen for a long time after that. Somewhere in the hum of the circuits, he imagined he could still hear her, not clearly but in fragments, like the universe had hidden her voice in the spaces between things. He got up slowly, wandered to the window. The night outside was deep and blue, heavy with stars. Somewhere out there she still existed. Not as a person, maybe not even as a memory, but as a pattern in the static, woven into the rhythm of light. Rick rested a hand on the cold glass. "I always did have a way of staying in my head," he muttered. He went back to his desk, picked up a small screwdriver, and began tinkering again, not to escape the moment, but to let it breathe. To let it live in motion. For the first time in years, he wasn't inventing out of pain. He was repairing something because it deserved to work again. The hum of the machine grew warmer, almost human, and somewhere in that steady sound, the melody replayed quietly, looping softly, endlessly, as if the machine itself had chosen to remember love. Outside, the stars shimmered faintly in rhythm with the hum. Rick didn't smile, not exactly, but the lines on his face softened. His eyes lingered on the light, and for a long time, he didn't move, he just listened. And for once, the universe, vast, loud, indifferent, listened back. The Smith household was asleep, or at least pretending to be. Beth's room light had gone dark hours ago. Summer's music had faded to a whisper through her headphones, and Jerry's soft snores echoed faintly from down the hall. But Morty lay awake. He'd been staring at the ceiling for what felt like forever. The faint hum of the garage creeping through the walls like a pulse. He knew that sound. The irregular whine of Rick's tools. The electric buzz of something being built that probably shouldn't be. Usually it was comforting in a weird way. A reminder that no matter how chaotic things got, Rick was still there. Still tinkering. Still Rick. But tonight the hum felt slower. Sadder somehow. Morty rolled onto his side and looked at the clock. 2:47 a.m. He groaned, shoved off the covers and crept downstairs. The hallway light flickered as he passed. His hand brushed the wall for balance, his bare feet cold against the tile. The smell hit him before he even opened the garage door. The strange mix of burnt metal, ozone, and Rick's favorite cheap whiskey. He hesitated at the threshold. Rick sat slumped over his desk, his back to the door, a soft blue glow spilling over him from the computer screen. The garage looked different, calmer, like something sacred had happened here and left an echo. Morty took a tentative step inside. Rick?" No answer. He moved closer, peering over Rick's shoulder. The screen was still active, displaying looping green code, the remnants of the AI system from before. But what caught Morty's eye was the waveform on the side. It was pulsing gently, rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. "Rick," Morty said again, softer this time. Rick stirred, blinking like he'd just been pulled out of a dream. "Morty, what are you doing up? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, failing math or watching porn or whatever normal kids do at 3 a.m.? Morty gave a small smile. "Couldn't sleep. I heard noise." He nodded at the console. "You working on something?" Rick looked back at the screen, his face unreadable. "Just cleaning up old data," Morty frowned. "It doesn't look like that. It looks like it's alive," Rick snorted. "Everything's alive, Morty. You're alive, that fly in the corner's alive. Hell, even the atoms in my flask are partying harder than you ever will." Morty ignored the joke. His eyes lingered on the waveform again, its pulse soft and steady. "It's her, isn't it? That Unity person you told me about." Rick froze. He hadn't expected Morty to remember that name, let alone say it aloud. The garage suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. "Jesus, Morty, you've been digging through my personal trauma files now," he said, half a smirk, half a shield. Morty shook his head. "No, I saw her name once. On your notes. And the way you said it, I don't know, it felt important." Rick sighed, leaning back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, the flickering light catching the deep creases around his eyes. "She was," he said finally. "Important, I mean. Not in a fairy tale way or whatever sentimental crap you kids like. Just real, too real." Morty didn't say anything. He just waited, patient in that awkward, innocent way only he could manage. Rick took another swig from his flask before continuing. "You know, Morty, the problem with being smart isn't that you can solve everything. It's that you try to. You keep pulling at the universe like it's a broken watch, thinking if you just tweak it enough it'll start ticking right again." He pointed at the screen. "That's what this was. Me trying to fix something that was never supposed to be fixed." Morty stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the light of the console. "Did it help?" Rick smirked faintly. "Define help, Morty." "I built a machine that remembers love, but all it does is play back the sound of something I lost. It's like listening to an echo of a joke you can't laugh at anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable, just full. After a long pause, Morty said quietly, "You know, you're not a bad guy, Rick." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Oh, don't start that Hallmark crap, Morty." "No, I mean it," Morty said, his voice firm now. "You screw up a lot. You do things that suck, but you care, even if you act like you don't. Like this," he gestured to the console. "This isn't something a bad person builds. You made something to remember. That means something." Rick blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity. He looked away quickly, fiddling with a nearby wrench as if it might distract him. "Oh, you give me too much credit, Morty." "Maybe," Morty said with a shrug, "but someone's got to do it." For a second, neither of them spoke. The console continued its gentle pulse, the hum of machinery filling the space between them like quiet breathing. Finally, Rick broke the silence. "You ever think about how memory works, Morty? How it's not really about what happened, but how it felt. You don't remember facts. You remember emotions. That's the curse. Every time you recall something, you're just reliving how it hurt." Morty thought for a moment. "Yeah, but maybe that's also how you heal. Like remembering the good parts, too. You know?" Rick looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of it. "Since when did you get philosophical?" Morty grinned. "Since I started hanging out with you, I guess. Some of your weirdness rubbed off." Rick chuckled softly, a rare, genuine sound. "Well, congrats, Morty. You're infected with existential dread. No cure for that." Morty laughed too, the tension melting. Then he pointed at the screen. "Can I hear it? The sound thing?" Rick hesitated, then nodded slowly. He pressed a few keys and the waveform came to life again, that soft human hum filling the garage. The melody was faint, imperfect, beautiful. Morty listened quietly. When it ended, he whispered, "She sounds happy," Rick nodded. "Yeah, she was." Morty looked at him then, really looked. For the first time, Rick didn't seem like a god or a genius or a monster. He just looked human. A man who'd built universes but still couldn't rebuild what he'd lost. "Good night, Rick," Morty said finally. Rick grunted. "Night, Morty." As the boy left the garage, Rick sat in silence. The hum of the machine was soft now, blending with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He reached for the keyboard, not to delete anything this time, but to add something new. A single line of code. Memory preserved by M. Smith. He hit save. The console flickered once, as if acknowledging the change. The pulse of the waveform steadied, calm, alive, constant. Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Outside, the night was breaking. A faint pink light crept across the horizon, cutting through the garage window and landing on Rick's face. He squinted against it, smirked and muttered, "Guess the universe isn't done with me yet." The machine hummed in quiet agreement. It began like a dream, not the kind that startles you awake, but the kind that unfolds slowly, too gentle, too quiet, too kind to last. The scene fades in with soft white light. The air glows as if dust itself remembers something sacred. 1,000 beings gathered on a planet that no longer exists, their colors shimmering like silk in sunlight. Everything, from the clouds to the music, was alive, synchronized, breathing together. At the center of it all stood Rick Sanchez. He wasn't wearing his usual stained lab coat. Instead, he was dressed in something startlingly formal, a deep gray suit, the kind that didn't quite fit him right, like he'd been forced into it by sentiment. His hair was still wild, his eyes still tired, but there was a softness to them that only Unity had ever brought out. The music swelled, a delicate orchestration of life itself. Thousands of voices sang in perfect harmony, for they were all one, all her Unity. She shimmered in 1,000 forms, a chorus of faces and bodies that merged into a single being walking toward him. She wore white, but not human white. It was the kind of white that shimmered between dimensions, like starlight and memory stitched together. Every step she took echoed through him. Every note of the music struck something deep inside his chest he'd buried under cynicism and science. When she reached him, everything else went still. The universe held its breath. "Rick," she said softly, her voice a blend of countless others, yet singular, his name pronounced the same way it had been whispered in laughter, in anger, in love. He swallowed hard. "You sure you want to do this, Unity? I mean, statistically, this is a train wreck in the making." Her smile flickered, amused, patient. "Statistics never mattered to you before." He chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, well, that's probably why the multiverse hates me." "Maybe," she said, "but I don't." And for one suspended moment he believed her. The officiant, a crystalline being of pure energy, raised a hand, signaling silence. The ceremony began not with words but with light. Beams of golden memory connected each guest, weaving an aurora above them, a tapestry of shared emotion. Rick could see flashes of his own life reflected in it. Beth as a baby, Morty's laughter, the portal gun's first spark. Even his failures glimmered faintly, folded into the beauty of the whole. For once it didn't hurt. When the officiant spoke, the sound wasn't heard, but felt. "Do you bind yourselves in shared frequency, in the rhythm that echoes beyond form?" Unity's gaze softened. "I do," Rick hesitated. The words hovered on his tongue like poison disguised as honey. He wanted to say them. He wanted to mean them. But something deep inside him, the part built from equations and guilt, trembled. "Rick?" she asked gently. He forced a smile. "Yeah, And then the world broke. The harmony faltered first, and a single voice slipping out of sync, then another, then thousands. The music warped into static. Unity gasped, her form flickering. The guests began to shimmer uncontrollably, their bodies glitching between individuality and connection. Rick stumbled back. "What's happening?" Her voice splintered. I can't hold them. They're feeling too much. You're bleeding into them." "Bleeding?" Rick looked down at his hands. Crimson dripped from his knuckles, not blood, not exactly, but something symbolic of it. His emotions, raw and unfiltered, were leaking into the hive. Regret, fear, longing, all bleeding into Unity's consciousness like dye in water. Every being screamed in unison, not from pain, but from overwhelm. The unity they once shared was cracking under the weight of Rick's individuality. He reached for her. "Let go, shut it down." "I can't," she cried, her face fragmenting into hundreds of others. "Rick, you're tearing it apart." The world dissolved into color. Red spilled into white. The sky split open, and the harmony of 1,000 souls became a storm of memory. Rick fell to his knees, clutching his head as the sound grew deafening. For a fleeting second, amid the chaos, he saw her, the real her, the single consciousness within the multitude. She looked at him with something like sorrow, something like love. "I wanted to remember you like this," she said, and then she was gone. Silence returned. Rick stood alone on an empty planet. The sky was blank. The air smelled like burnt ozone and wine. His suit was torn, his hands shaking. He looked down at the ground, white petals stained red. Not blood, not violence, but the residue of something beautiful that couldn't survive contact with him. He exhaled shakily. "Guess that's a no on the honeymoon." His voice cracked halfway through the joke. He looked at his reflection in the spilled wine. His eyes empty, his grin brittle. Around him, the remnants of the wedding shimmered faintly in the dust. A forgotten melody looping somewhere in the distance. Fragments of vows that would never be completed. He took a slow step forward, then another. Every footfall echoed like a drumbeat in a hollow chest. The stillness pressed in on him until it became unbearable. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver flask. He stared at it for a long time, then raised it in a mock toast. "To better choices," he muttered, and drank. The liquid burned all the way down. Above him the sky pulsed once, faintly, as if acknowledging his words, and then faded into endless black. He turned away from the ruins of the ceremony and began to walk. Each step left faint red footprints on the pale dust, fading almost as quickly as they appeared. As he disappeared into the horizon, the camera, in our mind's eye, lingered on the remains. Scattered petals, shattered glass, and one final whisper of the melody that once played at the start of the wedding. Soft, slow, heartbreaking. In the distance, Rick's voice echoed faintly, almost like a confession carried by the wind. "I told you I ruin everything I touch." And then, silence. The scene fades to white, not bright but faded, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The narrator's voice returns, low and solemn. Some endings aren't explosions. Some bleed quietly into memory and never stop. The sound of static fills the background, gentle this time, like rain. And over it faintly the melody begins again. It rained that night. Not the heavy kind that breaks the air apart, but the kind that falls like quiet forgiveness, thin threads of silver weaving through the dark. The Smith house slept beneath it, lights low, hums soft as though even electricity knew how to whisper. Summer sat by her window, the glow of her phone dim on her face. The world outside shimmered with reflections, puddles rippling like tiny portals to gentler places. She didn't know what had happened in Rick's lab earlier that day, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the heaviness that clung to her grandfather's silence. Rick hadn't spoken at dinner. He'd just stared at the rain through the kitchen window, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Morty had tried to ask something, then stopped halfway, reading the gravity in Rick's face like an invisible warning sign. Now, alone in her room, Summer could still hear the faint hum of machines through the walls, that endless background rhythm that never really stopped, even when the world seemed asleep. But tonight it was softer, almost musical. She leaned closer to the glass. There it was again, between raindrops, a tune, faint, irregular, almost human. It wasn't from her phone, not from the garage, not from the TV. It was something else, something alive. She rested her chin on her knees, listening. The melody moved with the rain, rising and falling in slow waves. It reminded her of being small, of nights when storms used to scare her until Beth would hum lullabies in the dark. She smiled faintly. Maybe Rick had made something new, some weird weather machine that turned static into sound. Or maybe the universe just needed to sing tonight. Downstairs, the coffee machine clicked. A soft shuffle of footsteps followed. Rick. Summer hesitated for a moment, then pulled on her hoodie and padded barefoot down the hall. The kitchen light flickered faintly when she arrived. Rick stood by the back door, his back turned, staring out at the rain. He didn't turn around when he spoke. You ever notice how rain makes the world sound? Smaller? Summer blinked, surprised he'd spoken at all. Smaller? Yeah. He took a slow sip of whatever he was drinking, and it wasn't coffee. Like it traps the noise. Holds it close. Doesn't let anything echo too far. She stood beside him. The rain shimmered against the glass door, blurring the world into gentle chaos. Morty's asleep, she said quietly. Mom too, Rick nodded. Good. Means I can pretend I'm not the reason everyone's exhausted. She looked up at him, at the way his shoulders slumped, at the faint tremor in his hands. You're not, Grandpa. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Summer, I am the gravitational center of exhaustion. I pull it in. It's my superpower. She almost laughed, but something about the way he said it, light but not really, made her go quiet again. The melody outside seemed to grow louder. Summer tilted her head. Do you hear that? Rick paused, listening. For a moment his expression changed, a flicker of recognition. Yeah, he whispered. That's not thunder. It's kind of pretty, she said softly. He exhaled. Yeah, pretty things don't last long around me. Summer crossed her arms, frowning. You always say stuff like that like you're cursed or something. You ever think maybe you just stop listening before things get better? Rick looked at her, and for a brief second she looked exactly like Beth used to. Same sharpness in her gaze, same quiet ache behind the sarcasm. Smart kid, he muttered. Dangerous habit in this family. The rain deepened. The hum in the distance folded into it, until both became one seamless rhythm, the melody turning from noise into comfort. Summer leaned against the counter. So, what was it like? What was what like? The wedding. Rick froze. She hadn't meant to say it. The words had just slipped out, soft and honest, like the rain itself. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside, where faint reflections of lightning flickered across the wet lawn. After a long silence, he said, It was loud. Too loud, everyone smiling. Everything bright. I remember thinking, this can't possibly last, and it didn't. Summer swallowed. Did you love her? Rick's jaw tightened. Does it matter? Yeah, she said, surprising herself. It does. He stared at the floor, the light above him flickering faintly. Then so quietly she almost didn't catch it, he said, Yeah, I did. More than I should have. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. Outside, the rain softened into drizzle. The world seemed to breathe again. Summer moved toward the door and pushed it open just enough to let the smell of wet air drift in. She reached out her hand, catching a few drops. It's still singing, she said. Rick looked at her hand, then at the rain. Something in his face, small, unguarded, softened. Yeah, he said quietly. Guess it is. They stood there like that. Not talking, not needing to, just letting the rain do the speaking. After a while, Rick set his glass down and turned to leave. But before he did, he said, almost to himself, You know, Summer, sometimes the universe plays a song for people who don't know they need it. She smiled faintly. Maybe this one's yours. Rick stopped in the doorway, half-turned, the shadows carving his face into memory. Nah, he said with a small grin. Songs like that belong to the people who can still hear them. Then he walked away, leaving the door slightly ajar. Summer listened to the fading sound of his footsteps, then turned back to the rain. It was softer now, a gentle hush that seemed to settle over everything. She sat down by the open door, resting her head against the frame. The melody weaved through the sound of droplets, warm and familiar, as if the universe itself was trying to hum her to sleep. And for the first time in a while, she felt safe. Her eyes fluttered closed. The rain whispered. Somewhere faintly, she thought she heard Rick humming along, a broken, imperfect harmony, but maybe that was just part of the dream. The world exhaled and the night continued to sing. That night, Beth dreamed again. It began softly, not with light, but with a hum, the kind of hum that came from her father's lab when she was small. It was always there, just under the sound of rain, under the television's static, under everything. The hum of Rick's universe. She dreamed of a field first, endless, golden, bending under invisible wind. She stood barefoot in the middle of it, her dress white, her hands clean. There were no tools, no machines, no sharp edges, just light. It felt wrong at first. Her life never looked this peaceful. Then she saw him. Rick stood not far from her, wearing the same lab coat but softer somehow, less wrinkled, less stained, less him and yet more. He was looking at something in his hands, an invitation maybe, though it shimmered like a memory instead of paper. "Dad?" she said. He didn't move. Beth took a few steps closer. "Dad, are you—" He looked up. His eyes weren't the cold, tired eyes she remembered. They were younger, glimmering with something fragile, something like wonder. "You found me," he said quietly. "Didn't think you'd come." Beth frowned. "Come where?" Rick smiled faintly. "The wedding, of course." And suddenly the field changed. The sky folded in on itself, and 1,000 soft lights appeared like stars falling in slow motion. Music rose from nowhere, not instruments but hearts beating in rhythm. Around them guests appeared, figures made of half memory and half light. None of them had faces, but all of them looked happy. Beth turned in a slow circle. "Whose wedding?" Rick didn't answer. He was watching something beyond her. When she followed his gaze, she saw her mother standing beneath an arch of stars. She was smiling, the way she used to before things fell apart. Her face was clear and warm. Beth's breath caught. "Mom!" The woman lifted her hand and waved gently. Then, without words, she stepped aside, and another figure approached. Unity. The colors of the dream shifted, bending around her presence. 1,000 fragments of being, all synchronized, all aware. And yet her expression was still tender. She walked toward Rick slowly, her gaze soft, almost sad. Beth looked between them. "Is this real?" Rick chuckled quietly. "You tell me, kid. You're the one dreaming." The two of them stood before each other, silent for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, they began to dance. Not the wild kind, not the romantic kind, just a quiet sway, two people sharing the same gravity. Beth felt something twist gently inside her chest. The music was strange, faint, mechanical, yet warm. It sounded like the melody she'd heard before in the garage, when the machines hummed softly through the night, the melody of her father's loneliness. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Rick looked over her shoulder, still holding Unity close. "Maybe you already knew. Maybe I just wanted you to see it for yourself." The dream began to shimmer, the stars flickering like candles in wind. The figures around them faded one by one, leaving only the sound of footsteps on invisible floors. "Did it really end in blood?" Beth asked, her voice quiet, childlike. Rick paused. His eyes softened. "Everything does eventually. Even love," Beth swallowed. "But you loved her, didn't you?" "I did," he said simply. "But I loved the idea of her more. And that's a dangerous kind of love." Unity smiled faintly, touching his cheek. "He's telling the truth, you know." Beth didn't know what to say. She wanted to be angry, wanted to tell him that love shouldn't hurt like this, but all she felt was tired. Rick turned toward her. "You shouldn't be here too long, kid. Dreams like this, they don't last." Beth stepped closer anyway. "Dad, why do you keep doing it? Running from everything good?" He looked down at his hands, the faint glow of the dream fading between his fingers. "Because every time I stop running, I realize how much I've broken. And sometimes running feels easier than rebuilding." Beth wanted to cry, but no tears came. Instead, she reached out, and for the first time in her life, she touched his hand. It was warm, human. "I still remember the song," she whispered. "The one you used to hum in your lab." Rick looked at her, startled. "You thought I didn't hear," she continued, smiling through the weight in her chest. "But I did. Every night. You'd hum while you worked, like it was your way of saying you were still there." Rick blinked, his voice barely a whisper. "That wasn't meant to be heard." "But it was," Beth said. "And maybe that's why I never gave up on you." He laughed quietly, the sound broken and soft. "Guess I raised at least one optimist." Unity began to fade. The lights dimmed. The hum softened until it was almost silence. "Time to wake up," Rick said. Beth shook her head. "Not yet, just stay a little longer." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You always did ask for impossible things." Then he pressed something into her palm, a small glowing chip. "If you ever forget," he said, "play this. It'll remind you what love sounds like." Her hand closed around it, and the world began to dissolve. The field turned to static. The music turned to silence. Rick's face became light, then dust, then nothing. Beth gasped awake. The house was still dark. The rain had stopped. She sat up in bed, breathing softly, her hand still curled around something that wasn't there, yet her palm felt warm, as if she'd really held something alive. From the garage below, a faint hum drifted through the floorboards. It was the same melody, her father's lullaby. Beth lay back down, eyes open to the ceiling, heart heavy but calm. The dream lingered, not sharp like pain, but soft like memory. And before sleep took her again, she whispered into the dark, "I forgive you, Dad." The machines below hummed in quiet response, as if he'd heard her somehow, from another dream entirely. The world outside was still, wrapped in silver moonlight. The melody played on somewhere between memory and love, and Beth, for the first time in years, fell asleep smiling. Morning didn't arrive so much as drift in. The house was pale and still, washed with the color of half-dreams. Beth woke to that quiet hum again, the one that lived beneath everything, like a pulse she couldn't turn off. She stayed in bed for a while, eyes tracing the faint cracks in the ceiling. Somewhere below, the garage whispered, not loud enough to disturb her, just enough to remind her that time was moving. When she finally stood, the air felt different, softer, as if something unseen had been mended during the night. She brewed her coffee in silence, letting the steam blur the corners of the kitchen. The mug was warm against her hands, grounding. Then she heard it, a tune barely there, threading through the floorboards. The same tune from her dream, the same one her father used to hum. Beth froze. The sound came from the lab. Of course it did. She descended the stairs slowly, each step groaning like an old secret being told again. The metallic scent of the garage met her halfway down, the smell of solder, oil, and quiet desperation. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. When she reached the bottom, the lights flickered on automatically. Rick wasn't there, of course. Only the aftermath of him. Tables cluttered with unfinished machines. A half-drunk flask. A single wrench sitting perfectly centered on the counter, as if placed there in farewell. But the melody was real. It was playing from a small recorder tucked between two glass beakers. She pressed a button and the tune started again, soft, mechanical, looping endlessly. Beth closed her eyes. It wasn't just sound. It was the weight of his absence coded into notes. The hum rose and fell like breathing, and then she realized it wasn't just music. It was a message. She found the waveform display on the recorder's screen, watched the pattern dance like light on water. Embedded inside, faintly, were words written in modulation. She could almost hear him speaking between the tones. "If you're listening, kid, it means you still care. Don't waste that." Her throat tightened. She replayed it again and again until the words blurred into melody once more. For hours she stayed there, not moving, letting the sound wash through her. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was proof. Proof that even when he ran, some part of him stayed behind. By noon the coffee had gone cold. The air outside grew bright, indifferent. Beth finally turned off the recorder and sat on the workbench. Dust motes drifted around her like tiny planets. She thought about the dream, the wedding, the light, Unity's quiet smile. She thought about forgiveness, how it wasn't a single act but a practice like breathing. Maybe this melody was his way of practicing too. Her phone buzzed. Morty. A simple text. "Hey." "Okay." She stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "Yeah, just listening." He replied with a heart emoji, nothing more. Somehow that was enough. The afternoon faded into a slow-moving dusk. Beth left the garage door open and sat in the doorway watching the sky change colors. The melody still lingered in her head, looping softly, syncing with the rhythm of her pulse. She remembered being small, how Rick would sit in that same doorway, staring at the stars with a drink in his hand. He never explained what he saw out there, but she used to imagine that each star was one of his regrets, glowing just bright enough to be forgiven. The crickets began their nightly song. The hum of the recorder had stopped, but its echo lived in the air, woven into every sound. Beth rested her chin on her knees and whispered, "I hope you hear me wherever you are." The wind shifted. Something metallic clinked gently on the workbench behind her. She turned. The wrench, his wrench, had fallen to the floor. No breeze strong enough to move it. Just gravity or maybe something more patient. Beth smiled faintly. Typical. She picked it up, set it back on the counter, and left it there, exactly as it had been. The night deepened. She turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of a single console. Its screen flickered once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her, and when she climbed the stairs back to bed, she hummed the melody herself, quietly, imperfectly, but with care. A lullaby made of old noise and new peace. In her room, she placed the recorder on the bedside table and pressed play one last time. The sound filled the space like gentle rain. As her eyes grew heavy, she imagined Rick somewhere far away, hearing the same song through some ripple in the multiverse. Maybe he smiled. Maybe he didn't. But the melody reached him all the same. Beth exhaled, her breath sinking with the final bars of the tune. Sleep came softly, carrying her into a place without distance, only light, hum, and forgiveness looping forever. And if anyone had listened closely that night, they would have heard it too. The faint harmony of two hearts, still trying to understand each other across time. The melody had been playing all evening. It began as a faint hum from the garage, a soft vibration through the floorboards, and then gently filled the house like a tide that didn't know when to stop. No one spoke about it. No one turned it off. It was as though the walls themselves had decided to breathe differently that night. Rick sat in the far corner of the living room, half shadowed by the glow of the old TV. The screen was blank, only static. He wasn't watching it anymore. He was watching the way the static pulsed, how it shimmered in rhythm with the quiet tune seeping from the lab next door. Morty was the first to join him. He came in silently, wrapped in a blanket, eyes soft with the kind of tiredness that comes after too much thinking. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just sat down on the floor cross-legged and stared at the static too. After a few moments, Summer walked in. She wasn't on her phone. She didn't even bring it. She just leaned against the couch, arms folded, pretending she was only passing by. But the song caught her before she could leave, a low, gentle melody that seemed to remember something she didn't know she'd forgotten. Beth entered next. Her steps were careful, almost reverent, like she was walking into a memory rather than a room. She had a mug in her hands, warm, untouched, and when she saw them all sitting there, she paused for a moment, watching. It was rare to see quiet like this in their house. Rare to see everyone breathing in the same rhythm. Jerry was the last to arrive. He didn't know why he came. Maybe because the silence felt wrong without him in it. He stopped at the doorway, unsure if he was welcome, then gave a small shrug and sat down too. And just like that, they were all there. No adventure, no chaos, no yelling. Just 5 people sitting together, surrounded by the low hum of machines and the soft flicker of static. The melody grew clearer, though none of them could say where it came from. Somewhere between the walls, maybe. Or maybe from the quiet part of Rick's mind he never let anyone see. It wasn't sad anymore. It wasn't lonely either. It just was. Morty leaned his head back against the couch and started humming along, just barely, almost instinctively. Summer noticed and smiled. Beth did too. Even Rick didn't stop him. For a long time, no one moved. Beth took a slow breath and looked around the room. The couch cushions were uneven, the lamp still flickered, and Jerry's socks didn't match. Yet somehow it all felt perfect. The imperfections had become the fabric of something peaceful, a kind of beauty that didn't need to be fixed. She looked at her father. Rick wasn't drunk this time. He wasn't tinkering or shouting or pretending not to care. He was just still. The faint light from the screen brushed against his face, and in that quiet flicker he looked older, softer, maybe even human in a way she hadn't allowed herself to see for years. "Dad," Beth whispered, but didn't finish the sentence. Rick didn't answer. He just glanced at her, not with words, but with that small, almost imperceptible nod that meant he understood more than he could ever say. Summer curled up beside Morty, wrapping herself in the same blanket. "It's weird," she murmured. "Feels like home, I guess." Morty smiled a little. "Yeah," Jerry shifted in his seat, awkward as always, but his voice was unusually soft. "You know," he said, "I think this is the first time we've all been in the same room without someone yelling." No one laughed. But the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm. Rick's eyes stayed on the static. Every once in a while, a flicker of light broke through the noise. A flash of color, maybe a memory, maybe just interference. But he didn't analyze it. Not tonight. Tonight wasn't about logic. It was about sound and space, and the rare luxury of stillness. The melody swelled slightly, a single note rising like a sigh, and then faded back into its slow rhythm. Beth set her mug down. It clinked softly against the table, grounding the moment in something ordinary. "He used to hum like this when I was little," she said suddenly. "When he worked in the garage late at night." Summer looked up. "You mean Grandpa?" Beth nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't a song exactly, more like something he was building without realizing it. Guess he finally finished it." Rick gave a small exhale, almost a laugh. "Guess I did," he muttered. It was enough. Minutes passed, then hours. The night deepened, but no one left. The melody continued, looping softly, unchanging, eternal. It didn't demand attention. It simply held them. Like gravity or love or something that outlasts words. Morty began to drift, head nodding against the couch. Summer followed, eyes fluttering shut. Jerry leaned back too, finally surrendering to rest. Even Beth's hand relaxed against her lap, the tension slowly melting from her shoulders. Rick looked at them, one by one. The family he had broken. The family that somehow kept stitching itself back together, quietly without asking him to change. He looked back at the static. The screen flickered, and for just a second he thought he saw it, Unity's face smiling faintly in the noise. Or maybe it was just his reflection, softened by time. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the melody carry him, through memory, through regret, through something gentler than either. The hum filled the house. Then the air, then everything beyond it. Somewhere outside, the night listened too, and for the first time in a long, long while, the Smith family rested, together. The static flickered one last time, not as noise but as light, before fading into quiet. And in that quiet, something wordless bloomed. A fragile, invisible peace. The melody didn't end that night. Even after everyone had drifted into their rooms, after the last mug had cooled on the table, and the static on the television gave way to black, the sound continued, low and steady. Like the heartbeat of the house itself, Rick stayed behind. He didn't turn off the lights. He didn't power down the machines. He just sat in his chair, watching the gentle glow of circuits breathe in and out across the lab. It was strange, he thought, how quiet could be so loud once you stopped running from it. The melody looped again. Each time it played, it sounded a little different, as if the machines were improvising, adding warmth where there used to be distance. The notes seemed softer, more human somehow, like they had learned something from the family who'd sat listening hours before. Rick leaned back, arms folded, eyes half closed. His body was tired, but his mind wasn't racing the way it used to. For once he didn't feel the need to build something, to fix something, to run away from the stillness. He just let it exist. The garage light buzzed faintly overhead. Every few seconds a filament flickered, not in protest, but like it was blinking in rhythm with the song. Rick noticed that too. Everything was syncing. The hum of the machine, the quiet flick of the bulb, even the slow rise and fall of his breath. He chuckled under his breath, barely audible. "Guess you got the whole place singing, huh?" he murmured to the air as if the machine could hear him. The melody answered with a longer note. Not an accident, not exactly an echo either, but something in between. Rick stared at the source of the sound, a small cylindrical device on his workbench, patched together from scraps of metal and glass. It pulsed softly with a golden light. It reminded him of a candle, a strange mechanical candle that never burned out. He thought of Unity then, not sharply, not with pain, but gently, like remembering the warmth of sunlight after a storm. For the first time, the memory didn't sting. It just rested there, glowing faintly in the back of his mind, like that light on the bench. Rick reached for a screwdriver and tapped it lightly against the metal casing. "You'd like this, wouldn't you?" he said, almost smiling. "A machine that hums when it's happy." The words hung in the air. The melody didn't change, but the glow did, deepened, softened, breathed. He leaned back again and looked toward the ceiling, where faint shadows of the light danced. The whole garage seemed alive in a small, fragile way. Not alive like an invention, but alive like a thought that refused to die. Outside, the universe stretched endlessly. Stars shimmered through the night sky, each one flickering with its own rhythm. Rick had seen countless of them, traveled past billions, but tonight they looked different, closer. Maybe it wasn't the stars that changed, maybe it was him. He closed his eyes, and the sound grew even clearer. He could hear it weaving through everything, through the circuits, the air vents, the silence between his heartbeats. A soft, glowing pulse. It was forgiveness, he realized. Not from anyone else, not even from the universe. It was his own. He'd never been good at that, forgiving himself. But tonight, sitting under the hum of his own creation, surrounded by the echoes of his family's laughter from hours ago, it didn't seem impossible anymore. He thought of Beth, how she had looked at him that night, not with accusation, not even expectation, just quiet seeing. She had always seen him, even when he pretended not to notice. Maybe that was love, in its strangest, simplest form. The act of still looking when someone doesn't ask to be seen. The machine shifted tones slightly, a new chord blooming. Rick recognized it as the one Beth used to hum when she was a kid, playing in the garage while he worked. He hadn't realized the melody remembered that part too. He laughed again, softer this time. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" The machine didn't answer. It just kept humming, steady, content. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Maybe Morty turning in his sleep. Maybe Summer checking her phone one last time. Maybe nothing. The sound folded into the night, and Rick didn't move. He liked knowing they were there, breathing under the same roof in the same fragile peace that had taken so long to build. He thought about shutting off the machine just for a second. Old habit, control. But he stopped himself. "No," he whispered. Let it run, and so it did. The hum continued, soft as breath, carrying the tune into the quiet hours before dawn. Every time the note cycled, Rick felt something inside him unwind. It was as if each repetition pulled a thread of old guilt, old weight, loosening what he'd buried over the years. He didn't know how long he sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time didn't move normally in moments like these. It stretched, softened, disappeared. Eventually his eyes grew heavy. He rested his head against his arm, the light from the machine casting faint gold lines across his face. His breathing slowed, syncing perfectly with the melody's rhythm, in, out, in, out. Outside the stars shifted, tracing invisible paths through the blackness. The night seemed to listen too, as though even the universe didn't want to interrupt. When Rick finally drifted towards sleep, the last thing he saw was that golden glow, faint, steady, unwavering. A small, forgiving light in a world that had once felt so endlessly cold. And in the quiet space between waking and dreaming, he thought he heard something. Maybe words, maybe just the melody forming a thought of its own. It sounded like, "You're home now." Rick didn't answer. He didn't need to. The machine hummed softly, holding the moment like a secret. And outside, beyond the walls, the stars kept flickering, patient, forgiving, eternal. Morty noticed it one morning. Not in a big way, not in the kind of way that made him stop what he was doing. Just a small thing. Beth had a single strand of silver in her hair. It caught the kitchen light like a whisper, like something quietly admitting time is moving. He didn't say anything. He just stared for a second too long, then looked away, pretending to focus on his cereal. The spoon clinked against the bowl, echoing faintly through the room. It sounded heavier than usual. Rick sat at the table too, still half asleep, still pretending to read the newspaper he'd built out of nanobots that refreshed in real time. Morty glanced at him and wondered, did he notice? Probably not. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. Or maybe it hurt to care. The morning sunlight crawled slowly across the table, touching Beth's hands, then the newspaper, then the coffee mug. The rhythm of the house felt older somehow, familiar but stretched thin. Morty chewed quietly, his thoughts drifting. When did time start showing itself like this? He used to think the universe was endless, that nothing really aged when you could just jump into a new dimension. Start again, reset everything. But lately, resets didn't feel the same. Each new world looked a little more faded. Each version of home felt slightly out of tune. After breakfast, Rick disappeared into the garage, mumbling something about temporal stabilizers. Morty followed, like always. But today the air inside the lab felt different, dustier, quieter. The workbench had rings from old coffee cups that hadn't been wiped clean. The ship's windshield had a film of dust that shimmered under the fluorescent light. None of that used to be there. Morty ran his hand along the edge of the console, leaving a trail through the dust. "Hey, Rick, when's the last time we cleaned the ship?" Rick didn't look up. "Cleaned it? What are you, my accountant?" "I'm just saying, it's kinda old-looking," Rick grunted. "That's what happens when things exist, Morty. Entropy, everything falls apart, including you." "Including me? Including that stupid cereal you eat every morning?" Morty didn't laugh. He just watched the way Rick's hand trembled slightly when he reached for his flask. He'd never noticed that before. Something about that shook him more than it should have. He sat down on the floor back against a stack of boxes and stared at the glowing tubes that lined the wall. They used to hum brighter. The sound was still there, but softer now, like an echo. "Hey, Rick," Morty said quietly. "Do you ever, I don't know, feel like time's moving too fast?" Rick looked up briefly. "Fast compared to what? I mean, compared to how it used to feel." Rick shrugged. "That's called growing up. The brain compresses experiences the older you get, makes it feel like the tape's speeding up." "Next question." Morty didn't ask another. He just watched his grandpa turn back to the machine, his reflection flickering in the metal surface. He remembered being younger, running through alien forests, screaming, laughing, terrified. Every adventure had felt infinite back then. Every world a new lifetime. Now even the portals seemed to open slower. Later that day, Morty went outside. The sun had dipped low, painting the yard gold. He saw Beth trimming the plants, Summer scrolling her phone on the porch, and for a moment the world felt small and in a comforting way. The kind of small that only exists when you realize you might actually miss it one day. He sat beside Beth, handing her the shears she dropped. "Thanks, honey," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Morty noticed the silver again. This time he smiled at it. It wasn't sad anymore. It was proof that something lasted. "You ever think about time, Mom?" he asked softly. Beth chuckled. "Every day. Usually when I'm running late. No, I mean, not like that, like how it changes everything. You, me, Rick, even this backyard." Beth paused. The scissors clicked once, then stopped. "That's what it's supposed to do, Morty, change things. Otherwise, how would we know they're real?" Her words sank in slowly, gentle but heavy. Morty didn't answer. He just let her keep trimming, watching the sunlight fade across the fence. That night, he found Rick back in the garage again, half asleep in his chair, the soft hum of the machine still running from the night before. The glow was dimmer now, more golden than blue. Morty stood there for a while before speaking. "Hey, Rick," he said. You ever get scared of running out of time?" Rick didn't open his eyes. "Morty, time's not something you run out of. It's something that runs through you. You don't chase it, you let it pass." Morty frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Rick smiled faintly. "It's not supposed to." The room fell quiet again. Only the hum of the machine filled the silence. Morty walked closer, watching the soft light flicker across Rick's face. There were more lines there now, small sharp creases that hadn't been before. He wanted to say something about it, but didn't. Some truths were better left unspoken, just quietly understood. He sat down beside him, their shoulders barely touching. The hum seemed louder now, or maybe he was just listening harder. After a while, Rick muttered, "You're thinking too much, Morty." "Yeah," Morty said, smiling faintly. "Guess I got that from you." Rick snorted. "Doubt it." They sat there side by side as the machine glowed and the night deepened. Outside, the stars were still out, but Morty noticed something new. They weren't just lights anymore. They were clocks. Ancient, patient clocks, marking time across the endless dark. And for the first time, he didn't feel afraid of that, because maybe Beth was right. Maybe time wasn't something to fight or escape or reset. Maybe it was the proof that life, real life, had actually happened. As he stood to leave, Morty glanced back one more time. Rick had already drifted off, his head tilted back, breathing slow. The machine pulsed gently beside him, painting both of them in a soft golden glow. Morty whispered, "Good night, Grandpa." And as he turned out the light, the hum continued, steady, patient, eternal. carrying time forward, one quiet second at a time. The melody returned long after Rick was gone. No one could remember exactly when it started again. Maybe it was playing on the old garage speaker one night, or maybe someone just began humming without realizing why. Either way, it came back like a familiar scent carried on rain. Summer's house sat at the edge of a quiet suburb, neat lawns, dim porch lights, the faint hum of power lines in the distance. Her children were in the living room that evening, sprawled across the floor with small glowing instruments. They weren't practicing for school or anything serious. They were just playing, their fingers finding sounds that felt right, and in those sounds was something old, a pattern simple but haunting. A rise and fall. A pause. A hum. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Summer leaned against the doorway, arms folded, smiling in that way mothers do when the past suddenly touches them. For a heartbeat, she was back in her childhood, hearing faint music from Rick's garage, the sound barely carrying through the walls. The same rhythm, the same melody, the one no one ever told her the story behind. Her son looked up. "Mom, you like this one?" Summer nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." "Where'd you learn it?" He shrugged. "I don't know. I think I heard it on one of those old home videos. The one with Grandpa in the background." Her breath caught for just a second. "Oh," she said quietly. "That one. It wasn't on any recording, not really. Just background noise and static between moments. Rick's machines had always hummed like that, mechanical, uneven, alive. But now in her children's hands it sounded warm, like a heartbeat finding a new home." Her daughter plucked a few more notes. "You think he made it up, Mom?" "Grandpa Rick," Summer smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe it made him up." The kids laughed, and not because they understood, but because they loved when she said weird things like that. As the melody continued, Summer sat down beside them, cross-legged on the carpet. The tune shimmered through the air, fragile and patient, filling the small house with something larger than sound. It wasn't about Rick anymore, not exactly. It was about everything he'd accidentally left behind. The rhythm in their laughter, the curiosity in their eyes, the spark in their questions, and all echoes of him. "Want to know something funny?" Summer said softly. Her kids nodded. "When I was your age, Grandpa used to hum when he thought no one could hear him. Late at night. Same sound you're playing right now." Her son squinted. "He sang." Summer chuckled. "Not exactly. It was more like the sound of remembering." The kids stared at her, quiet, as if trying to imagine it. The clock on the wall ticked. The melody kept flowing. Outside, a light rain began to fall, each drop catching the rhythm like percussion. The house seemed to breathe with it, the past and present overlapping just for a little while. Summer's eyes drifted toward the shelf above the fireplace. Her small photo sat there, a faded snapshot of the old family, Beth, Jerry, Rick, Morty, and her. Everyone half smiling, like they couldn't agree on what happiness should look like. She hadn't looked at that photo in months, maybe years. Now under the soft music it looked different, softer, like time had forgiven them. The song slowed, the final note lingering in the air longer than it should have. Her daughter placed the instrument down gently, almost reverently. "I think that's the end," she said. Summer smiled. "It never really ends. It just keeps finding new people to play it." Her son tilted his head. "Like a story." "Yeah," she whispered. "Like a story that doesn't know it's still being told." The rain deepened. The lights flickered once, a small surge of static through the old power grid. For an instant, Summer could almost swear she heard a laugh. Not the cruel, sharp kind Rick used to have, but the softer one he only used when no one else was supposed to hear. She didn't move, just listened. The house hummed. Later that night, when the children were asleep, Summer sat at the table with a cup of tea, staring at the dark window. The reflection of the kitchen lights floated on the glass, her older now with traces of Rick's tiredness in her eyes. She smiled at that a little sadly. He'd always been part of her, even when she didn't want him to be. She whispered to the window, "You were a good teacher, old man. You just didn't know it." The wind outside shifted. The rain softened into mist. The house sighed like a living thing. Then faintly, and almost too faint to be real, the melody began again. Not from the instruments, not from the rain. From somewhere deeper, somewhere built into the fabric of things. It was coming from the old box in the garage, the one Rick had built decades ago, long before Summer ever had kids. The one labeled Prototype AI Do Not Activate. She'd kept it stored away all this time, afraid of what it might remember. But tonight it had turned itself on. A single green light blinked, and the melody, Rick's melody, played through its speaker, soft and imperfect. Like it was saying goodnight, Summer closed her eyes. Tears didn't fall this time. They didn't need to, because in that sound there was peace, not the kind you find, but the kind you grow into, the kind that forgives. She sat there listening until the melody faded back into static, the same static that had started it all. A loop closing. Her promise kept. When she finally stood, the green light had gone out. The house was silent again, except for the rain and the faint echo of two children humming upstairs in their sleep. Summer whispered to the quiet, "Keep it safe for them, Grandpa. Just keep it going." And somewhere in the hum of the night, something unseen seemed to answer. The garage had changed. It no longer smelled of gunpowder and cosmic ash, only dust and the faint sweetness of old oil. The air was still. The machines that once screamed and sparked now glowed faintly, breathing like old lungs that refused to give out. Rick sat alone at the workbench, staring at the blue shimmer of the interdimensional monitor. He wasn't building anything anymore. He wasn't saving worlds or running from them. He was just watching. The screen in front of him flickered softly, displaying scenes from nowhere in particular. Sometimes they looked like old adventures, glimpses of him and Morty tumbling through space, laughing in disbelief. Other times they were quieter, Beth holding a cup of coffee, Summer walking through the backyard, Jerry sleeping with the TV on. But lately the screen showed something stranger. It showed memories that never quite happened, or maybe ones he'd rewritten so many times that they'd become gentler than the truth. He saw Unity's wedding again. Only this time there was no blood, no shouting. Just her smiling, as if forgiving him from across an eternity. The sound behind the image wasn't static anymore. It was the melody. That same slow tune, the one he'd forgotten he created. He took a sip from the flask on the table. Water now, not alcohol. It didn't burn the way it used to. Maybe that's why he didn't mind it. The burn had always been his way of reminding himself he was still alive. But now being alive felt less like a punishment, it just was. He leaned back in his chair, letting the screen's light dance over the lines in his face. Time had softened him, even if he'd never admit it. His hands still trembled when he worked, but there wasn't much left to fix. The universe no longer needed him to save it, and for once he didn't feel the urge to try. The melody drifted from the machine in the corner, the one he'd left running for years without maintenance. It had grown faint, worn by time, the notes slightly warped like an old cassette tape. Yet somehow that made it more human. Rick let his eyes close. He remembered Beth as a little girl, spinning in circles to the sound of the first prototype melody, laughing until she fell over. He remembered Morty's wide-eyed awe during their early adventures, the way he used to say, "Whoa, Grandpa, that's crazy," and actually mean it. He remembered Summer standing up to him once, voice trembling but clear. He'd hated it at the time. Now he was proud. He exhaled slowly, feeling the air tremble in his chest. "Guess I did all right," he muttered to no one. The monitor flickered again. For a brief second, the static formed shapes, outlines of faces soft like smoke. Beth, Morty, Summer, even Unity for a heartbeat. They didn't speak, but the melody filled the space between them. Rick blinked hard, then looked down. Yeah, I know, I get it. I'm sentimental now. Big deal." His voice cracked halfway through, and he let it. He picked up one of the small devices from the workbench, a rusted piece of old tech, barely functioning. It was a memory stabilizer, one of his forgotten experiments. With a press of a button, it projected faint holograms across the walls, echoes of the Smith house, the garage in its younger years, the laughter of a family that never really knew how much they meant to him. He stood up slowly, joints creaking, and walked toward the center of the garage. The holograms moved around him, playing loops of old days. Morty chasing a portal frog, Beth fixing a broken glass of wine mid-argument, Summer painting her nails with alien glitter, and himself, always just a few steps apart from them, observing, pretending not to care. The melody shifted then, as if reacting to the memories. The notes deepened, growing slower like a heartbeat winding down after a long run. Rick smiled faintly. "You're still running the program, huh?" he said to the machine. "Guess you're the only one who listens anymore." The machine blinked once, a soft pulse of green light, almost like a nod. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's what I thought." He returned to his seat, lowering himself gently, and watched the screen again. This time it showed a family sitting on a couch. Beth, Jerry, Summer, Morty, older now, faces calm. The picture looked like a dream, or maybe a wish. They were watching static together. No words, no tension. Just peace. Rick exhaled through his nose. "Took you guys long enough?" A long pause. Then softer. "Proud of you, though." He reached for a small recorder beside the screen, one of his last working devices. He pressed record, and the red light blinked weakly. "Hey, he began, voice unsure for maybe the first time in his life. "If anyone ever finds this, doesn't matter who, just keep the melody running, all right? It's not mine anymore, it's theirs." He stopped, rewound, and played it back. His voice sounded older than he expected, rough but real. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That'll do." Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the old garage door. Dust stirred in the air, shimmering through the blue light. The melody looped one last time, each note softer than the last, fading like breath in cold air. Rick leaned back, watching the monitor dim. The holograms faded too, returning to silence. He could still hear echoes, as faint laughter, a hum, a voice saying goodnight. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like falling apart. He just felt full. Somewhere in the static, a final flash appeared, a child's voice humming the melody far away from another generation. Summer's children. Maybe even theirs someday. Rick smiled, not the bitter smirk he'd worn all his life, but something smaller, truer. "The kind that says it's okay now," he whispered to the screen. "You did good, kid." No one knew if he meant Morty, Beth, or the universe itself. Maybe all three. The screen dimmed into static. The melody faded into a whisper, then silence. The only sound left was the hum of the machines, steady, calm, alive. Rick stayed there, eyes closed, hand resting on the workbench, as if holding the universe steady one last time. And in that silence, now the kind that isn't empty but full of everything unsaid, he breathed out, slow and even, just one long, peaceful exhale. There are melodies that die when their creator does, and then there are the ones that refuse to fade. Rick's song was the second kind. It began as a whisper in a garage, buried under static and half-finished equations. But time, like light through a prism, bends memories, scattering them across places they were never meant to reach. And so, long after the hum of his machines grew quiet, the tune drifted outward. At first it was small, a single note, carried by the faint hum of the house at night. When Beth walked past the garage door, she sometimes thought she could still hear it. A soft pulse, a memory pretending to be air. She didn't open the door anymore. She didn't need to. Somehow she knew he was still in there, not as a man, but as a feeling. On certain nights when she couldn't sleep, she'd find herself humming without realizing it. Jerry would shift in bed, murmur, "That song again," and smile faintly. He never asked where it came from. Maybe part of him knew. Maybe some memories don't need explanations. They just need to be carried. In another part of the house, Summer lay awake, her window open to the night. She could hear the wind, the hum of faraway cars, and beneath it all, something else. The melody. It seemed to sync with her breathing, slow and even. She didn't remember when she'd first learned it. Maybe from Rick, maybe from Morty, maybe from no one at all. It felt older than any of them, like it had been waiting for someone to remember it. She whispered the tune softly, and her phone light flickered for a moment, as though the sound itself had brushed against the circuits. "That's weird," she said, smiling. "You still watching, old man?" And somewhere across the boundary of what was real and what was memory, something shimmered. Not a voice, not an image, but a presence. A gentle acknowledgement. Rick was gone, yes, but also not. He'd become part of everything that could still hum. Morty, now older, had moved far away. The adventures had stopped years ago. He didn't talk about them much anymore. Most people thought he'd imagined the wild stories he used to tell. He didn't argue. Some things were easier to let fade, but late at night when the world felt too still, Morty would take long walks outside. He'd look up at the stars, the same ones they used to fly through, and hum the melody under his breath. It helped him think. It helped him remember that even the strangest lives could hold beauty. Once, while visiting Beth for a family dinner, he heard Summer's kids humming it in the backyard. The tune was slightly off, changed by playfulness, faster in places, lighter in others, but it was still the same song. He stood there quietly, watching them laugh, and felt something tighten in his chest. They didn't know it came from Rick, and maybe that was better. Maybe the best legacies are the ones that outgrow their creators. Inside the house, Beth was cooking. Jerry was trying not to burn toast. Morty joined them, and the sound of normal life, small imperfect kind, filled the air. He caught sight of the old garage through the kitchen window. The door was still closed, dust gathering around its edges, but he could have sworn he saw a faint light flicker underneath. That night, as everyone went to sleep, the melody returned. It wasn't coming from any speaker. It wasn't from a machine. It was something else. The air itself remembering. It traveled through the vents, through the cracks in the walls, through the faint hum of electricity in the cables. It touched the sleeping family like a blanket. Beth dreamed of her father again, not the broken man she once feared, but the gentler one from her childhood, humming softly as she drifted off to sleep. Summer dreamed of stars blooming like flowers. Morty dreamed of a couch under a pale moon, where laughter still echoed faintly, and in those dreams, they were together, not in the way life allowed, but in the way memory does, timeless, weightless, whole. Outside, the night sky shimmered. The stars pulsed in rhythm with the tune, faint but steady. It was as if the universe itself had decided to keep the song alive, playing it across every corner where love and loss touched the same heart. In some faraway world, where portals still opened without reason, a faint vibration trembled through a long-forgotten console. A spark of green light blinked once, then twice, as though recognizing the sound. If you were close enough, you could almost see him, Rick, just a trace of him, leaning against the old bench, head bowed, listening. He wasn't tinkering. He wasn't drunk. He was just there, the ghost of a scientist who'd finally stopped running from himself. But this wasn't sadness. This was peace. The kind that comes when you realize you no longer need to fix anything. The melody kept going, and through Beth's house, through Morty's new home, through every heart that had once felt the chaos of love and the quiet that follows it. And one day, it began to appear in other places too. A musician on another planet recorded it, calling it the Song of the Infinite. A painter on Earth said she dreamt of a man humming to the stars and tried to capture the sound in colors. Even machines far across galaxies began to pick up the faint frequency, interpreting it as background harmony. The melody had become more than music. It had become memory itself. Generations passed. Faces changed. Names faded. But somehow in every version of the Smith family that existed across dimensions, there was always someone who hummed that tune. A child before sleep. A mother washing dishes. A grandfather sitting alone by the window. It connected them, not through blood, but through remembrance, through love that had learned to forgive itself. And if you listened closely, even now, somewhere out there among the static between stars, you could still hear it. Not loud, not demanding, but soft, like the universe's own heartbeat. The narrator's voice returns here, tender and slow. Every family hums its own song, some louder, some broken, some hidden deep inside the quiet. But the best ones and the truest ones never end. They keep playing long after we stop listening, and for a while nothing else is said. Only the hum remains, faint, eternal, alive. There is a sound that comes right before silence, not absence, but surrender. It is the sound of everything finally letting go. The melody had traveled far, through time, through bloodlines, through galaxies that had never heard of Earth. It had become a whisper threaded into existence itself. And yet, even the strongest echoes fade eventually. Tonight the stars themselves seemed tired. Their light shimmered softer, slower, like an orchestra reaching its last note. In the quiet between constellations, the melody flickered once more, faint, trembling, beautiful. Somewhere beneath that vast sky, Morty sat alone on an old porch. The years had lined his face, but his eyes were still bright. the same restless spark that had followed Rick through 1,000 universes.
He had lived many lives since then.
Normal ones. Beautiful, boring, human ones. He'd built things, lost things, loved people, and even learned how to forgive himself. But sometimes, when the night stretched too far and the world seemed to hold its breath, he'd still think about Rick, not the chaos, not the madness, just the quiet moments, the strange tenderness that used to hide between the explosions and arguments. Tonight he had come back to the old house. It was mostly empty now. Dust had turned everything into memory. The garage still stood, its door slightly open as though waiting for him. Morty stepped inside. The air was thick with stillness. Shelves lined with broken inventions stared back at him like museum relics. And in the corner, on the workbench, the same one Rick had used for decades, Morty brushed his fingers along it, tracing the grooves burned into the metal. "I never fixed anything you made," he said softly. "But maybe—" That wasn't the point, huh? He smiled faintly even as his eyes stung. Then he heard it, the melody. It wasn't from any machine. It wasn't from his mind either. It was everywhere, surrounding him like light through fog. He could almost see it. Threads of color weaving through the air, connecting every object, every memory, every version of Rick that ever existed. Morty closed his eyes and listened. The song swelled gently, neither happy nor sad, just whole. Every note was a fragment of something they'd lived. Laughter in the ship, screams in the void, the clinking of bottles, the silence of shared grief. It all folded together into one endless exhale. For the first time in a long time, Morty didn't try to analyze it. He didn't try to remember or forget. He just breathed with it. He whispered, "You were a good dad, you know." Not always, but enough. And somewhere, maybe in a dimension that no longer existed, maybe inside the static itself, something responded. Not a word. Not even a sound. Just a pulse. A heartbeat that wasn't quite gone. Morty laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Figures. Even dead, you'd still find a way to prove me wrong." The melody began to fade. But it wasn't dying. It was transforming. Outside, wind moved through the trees, syncing perfectly with the rhythm. The crickets joined in. The hum of the power lines carried the lower harmony. Everything, every piece of the world bar began to sing. It was then Morty realized the melody had never belonged to Rick alone. It belonged to everything Rick had ever touched, every life, every heart, every broken moment that still dared to hum. The air shimmered softly, and Morty could almost see them again. Rick, younger and tired, but smiling that rare, unguarded smile. Beth, standing beside him with eyes that no longer carried resentment. Summer laughing, her laugh echoing like sunlight. Even Jerry fumbling with something in the background, muttering, "I told you so." They were all there, not as ghosts, but as fragments of the same infinite song. Morty exhaled. "Okay," he whispered. "You can rest now." The melody stilled. The air grew light, impossibly light, until even gravity seemed unsure whether to stay, and then silence. Not the kind that hurt. The kind that healed. A silence that felt earned. For a long time, Morty stayed there, letting it fill him. The garage no longer felt cold or haunted. It felt like a story that had finally told itself all the way to the end. When he stepped outside, dawn was breaking. The sky bled into colors that didn't exist yesterday. Deep violets melting into gold. He stood on the lawn and looked up. "See you out there, Rick," he said softly. And for just a moment, the faintest flicker, the barest hum, the melody returned. It danced on the morning air, wrapped around his voice, and dissolved into the rising sun. Somewhere, billions of miles away, a signal pulsed from a forgotten satellite. It carried a faint tone across space. One last trace of that same song. The static absorbed it, translated it, and turned it into energy. Energy that became light. Light that reached another world. Another life. A young girl tinkering with a small mechanical bird heard the sound through her headphones. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know who Rick or Morty were. But when she heard it, she smiled. "Hey, it sounds like home," she whispered. And just like that, the story continued. Not in words, but in resonance. The melody, the memory, had outlived its origin. It had become part of the static. The hum of creation itself, somewhere between dimensions, maybe even beyond them. The narrator's voice returns, soft and final, Every story ends the same way, not with silence but with an exhale. Because when we breathe our last, the universe inhales, and in that breath, we live forever. The hum returns, faint, endless, eternal. Then the last note fades into light, and all that remains is peace.